Hello, Sami Abdenoor again. Today our subject is Ahwaz. For those of you who don't know what Ahwaz is, where Ahwaz is and what Ahwaz is, Ahwaz is currently in the southernmost western part of, not southernmost, in the southwest corner of the state of Iran on the Arabian Gulf. The Arabian Gulf is what Western sources call the Persian Gulf. Why it is not at all Persian is exactly because it is not at all Persian. There are no Persians on that Gulf. Both sides of the Gulf are Arab. The, the Arab states on the Gulf are Iraq, Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia, and parts of the Emirates. On the opposite side, within what is now Iran, is Ahwaz, which is an Arab territory populated by Arabs inside Iran who were occupied in 1925 by Iran. So the entire mouth of the Gulf, on both sides, are Arabs, no Persians. However, the West insists on calling it the Persian Gulf because it wants to eradicate Arabs from it. And this has been Western policy for a very long time. All you have to do is try and research Ahwaz on Google, and you'll find how extreme the Western narrative is, historical narrative, in blotting out the history of Ahwaz and creating in its stead a fabricated Iranian history. There is no Iranian history to Ahwaz. Ahwaz was an Arab emirate throughout history. Geographically, sociologically, and historically, it's part of southern Iraq. The ancient civilizations of Mesopotamia, Ur, Sumer, Akkad, and Ilam. Ilam is Ahwaz. So this goes way back to 5000 BC and more. The same civilization, the same cuneiform writing, the same ziggurat structures, and the same geography and topography of marshes and alluvial plains of southern Iraq. Of course, Persia is a rugged, mountainous, barren region with very little water, no oil, and no gas. All these resources come from Ahwaz, from Arab Ahwaz. And it has been the entirety of Iranian history, Persian history, has been a quest to occupy southern Iraq and Ahwaz, which finally came to fruition in 1925. The Iranians forcibly, by force, occupied the Arab Emirate of Ahwaz. Before 1925, Ahwaz was an independent Arab emirate with an emir called Khaz'al bin Jabir al-Ka'bi, and it had treaties with great powers, among them Great Britain, and it had nothing to do with Iran. The history of Iran at the time, we're speaking of the 1920s, the eve of the First World War and its aftermath. To understand why the West is so insistent upon giving Ahwaz to Iran, you must understand that the history of Iran at that time was sort of a joint Russian Great British interest. They were both interested in Iran. Russia, because Iran is on its southern border, simply. Great Britain, because Iran consisted of its continuum, its line of communications with its empire in India, the British Empire with the British holdings in India. But this did not include Ahwaz. Ahwaz was an independent Arab emirate. It had nothing to do with Iran. It was not under Iranian occupation. However, British interests toppled Russian interests at a point when the British discovered oil for the first time in human history. Oil was discovered in Ahwaz. Uh, Western sources will tell you that it was discovered in Iran because they want to, as I said, eradicate the history of Ahwaz. Actually, there is no oil in Iran, nothing of any substance. All the oil is in Ahwaz. It was in Ahwaz that the oil was discovered. At the time, it was not even occupied by Iran yet, because Britain would allow that occupation later on. So around the year 1908 or 10, the British discovered oil in Ahwaz. So they immediately signed treaties with the Emir of Ahwaz, whereby they wanted to appease his concerns. In the case of the extraction of oil, he was afraid that the great powers would become interested in occupying Ahwaz. So the British, in their treaties with Emir Khaz'an, the Emir of Ahwaz, the Arab Emir of Ahwaz, guaranteed that they would defend Ahwaz against any occupation and prevent foreign intervention if he allowed the extraction of oil and the establishment of an oil refinery in Abadan, which is an Arab city in Ahwaz, on the Arabian Gulf. In an exchange for his support of Great Britain in World War I, which was granted after World War I, the Iranian army at the time was still under Russian supervision and command. The Russians trained and supplied the army, and among these recruits was a soldier called Rida Shah Pahlavi. He was a soldier under Russian command. However, the British had other plans for him and for Iran. So they supported him as he rose through the ranks, and Rida Shah became later on the commander-in-chief and the prime minister, and later on the supreme ruler of Iran. During this time, the British had discovered oil, as I said, in Ahwaz, and they, at the same time, established the Iranian British Oil Company in Iran. I repeat, Ahwaz was an independent emirate, and all the oil was in Ahwaz. There is no oil in Iran, so why would the British do that? It gave concessions to the British to extract all the oil in Iran. No sooner was the company set up than they allowed Iran to occupy Ahwaz by force. 1925. So Rida Shah Pahlavi entered Ahwaz, killing, looting, burning, scorching the ground, razing everything to the ground to take control, because the Ahwazis fought back fiercely, and they faced a tragic fate, of course. He took 3,000 prisoners and paraded them all the way from Ahwaz to Tehran, where they died on the way, because it was a very rugged, tremendously cruel way of killing them. And they scorched the earth in Ahwaz, burning, killing, looting, and paving the way for Iranian Persian settlement of Arab land. Now, after less than a century, around a century, give or take 5 or 6 years, the Iranians continue their settlement policy, killing, looting. Most recently, making Ahwazis thirsty, cutting off their water supplies. So this is not simply a shortage of water in Iran, it is a continuation of the systemic settlement of Ahwaz by Persians and killing off of its Arab inhabitants in order to steal its wealth. All of this is blotted out in Western sources, because it is Western doing, it's Western policy. Salam.